SmarterMarkets is back at FIA Boca. We're happy to be joined by Josh Crumb, founder and CEO of Abaxx Technologies. Good to have you here, Josh.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Good to be here.
So if we're starting to get the wrap up of the conference on day 2, so we got a little noise in the background. And I wanted to get into it. This is one of the big tentpole conferences of the year. It's where kind of the whole cleared markets industry gets together. And what brought you to Boca this year, Josh? And what did you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So, look, first I want to start off by saying that the views and opinions of the founder and CEO are not necessarily those of the company, because I do have some opinions of some things going on here that I maybe talk about a little bit at the end. But, to start on a more positive note, I am, very, very happy. One of the key focuses of Abaxx coming here beyond, obviously, the growing liquidity on our exchange and the growing connectivity, which is always a big part of being down at Boca, seeing the FCMs, seeing the ISVs and service providers and the whole ecosystem that makes a market. But as well, we came on the technology side of the business to start introducing our Market OS platform and our real-time digital title platform to FCMs and really, it's not a sort of a full launch. It's much more of, sort of step 2 past our pilots and having the conversations. And that was probably the big focus. But again, this is also our first FIA Boca where we've got volume and open interest daily, which is obviously after coming here for 6 years in the build phase, it was obviously very very important and just a very different approach when you're having the meetings. Now that we've obviously got a live market.
Right. And much of the agenda this year at Boca was 24/7 clearing, tokenization, the convergence of traditional finance with DeFi, really putting digital market infrastructure front and center. As you were listening to what others are doing in the ecosystem, where do you think we're at as an industry? And what do you feel that what you're doing is going to add to that?
Well, it's really interesting how fast everything has moved over the past, particularly the past 12 months. I would say, probably part of that is all the things that happened with the new U.S. administration, the Genius Act, and kind of how that started bringing the crypto markets, probably further into the regulated markets. And so, things that were probably more conversational and now execution are things like 24/7 markets, talking about stable coins and alternative forms of real-time collateral. Those were certainly things that were, again, people have been working on, thinking about for years, particularly in the blockchain space. But now I think the words that were used with almost every FCM we sat down with is, we have to look at this seriously. I would say there weren't that many that have their, the full grasp of what they're doing there. With a few exceptions that were kind of involved in some of the panels, Merrick's, working 24/7, as few as, a few others that we spoke to. But I would say most are in the phase of, okay, we've been having pilots, we've been having programs for years. Now we got to get serious about operationalizing some of these. So yeah, it's certainly moved quick since the last conference.
And when it comes to operationalizing it, is there a missing ingredient that you see in common?
Well, one of the kind of funny, comments and discussions at the actual 24/7, panel and event was one of the one of the people that was there kind of representing the technology side. And they're like, well, yeah, even in the existing banks, our software doesn't really quit. It's the people, it's the operations that check out, rather than the software. I think he made some anecdote. He's like, we can even see in the data, even the hackers take lunch, and that's really a 24/7 operation. Is people trying to hack you? And you can see it in the data that they went on lunch break. Right? So at the end of the day, the systems, I think, are more and more being built and allow for these things. I think you even go back to when the markets moved to T+1 in the U.S. I think there was a lot of fear and a lot of nervousness. But again, it was really just an operational issue. The systems, the IT systems, were really basically there.
And you've always been focused on commercial markets, commodities. big part of the conversation this year, of course, has been prediction and event markets. What are your thoughts on the direction you see the exchanges going?
Yeah, that's the big one that I think I alluded to at the beginning here. Look, a lot of the futures markets started with that natural risk transfer. A farmer, needing to sell crops before investing all of the capital and the planting and so forth. So, I mean, really, it's that mismatch, that traditional mismatch between I'm a producer and all of my revenue is tied to a top line, but my consumer maybe doesn't necessarily have that same risk threshold. Particularly if you're an input commodity, then you're always passing that price along the supply chain. So the seller a lot of times is more exposed than the buyer to the actual price and volatility of the commodity. So that naturally needs the speculator, right? So a speculator, that can be used with all sorts of negative connotations. But at the end of the day, that speculator is an important part of making a market, particularly when you have that risk mismatch, and that's the purpose of the market. Ultimately, I think these prediction markets. That's kind of the nature of futures markets in many ways. However, what I don't like is just the how much the just the straight up gambling market is coming into regulated futures markets, and I think a lot of it's coming through the nature of these event type situations, and this is where frankly makes my blood boil. That ultimately this is in my view this is not a market like in that conversation or that example or analogy I was using between the buyer, the seller, and the speculator, that is a proper risk transfer mechanism. What you see here with a lot of these gambling markets, these prediction markets, is this is just a big data operation. This is not a risk matching of buyers and sellers. It's a strip mining operation. You're going after the data, particularly of vulnerable retail consumers, and you're sitting there mining all their data, understanding their biases, and then feeding them the easiest way to bet on something they're going to lose. This is the house taking money. This is not a risk transfer mechanism, and I think it has no room in public markets. Or if it does, we got to take a long, hard look of what we're actually doing in these markets. So, look, I'm not saying that events and the wisdom of crowds, can't be useful, but it should not be a free for all. And I don't like some of the stuff I'm seeing.
It's a really interesting perspective because I think I learned from you always look at who's getting the data when it comes to technology. And it seems like that's not a conversation I've heard here about the data gathering aspects of these particular markets. Wondering if there's anything that's come up here this week that has surprised you in terms of the conversation or any interesting ideas that you're taking away from this conference.
Well, I think, going back to the 24/7 and real time, I think the collateral movements and we're obviously very focused on that in what we're doing with our Market OS platform. Um, but I would say the views on stable coins are still very mixed, very uncertain. A lot of operational challenges, a lot of things that are happening that. So if you look at the headlines and you look at some of the panels, I think there's a certain narrative, but behind the scenes, again, operationally, I don't see stable coins as close to being used in regulated commodity markets as soon as maybe some people are thinking. But we'll see. I mean, we have heard, I think they've announced it. Some of the major exchange operators are moving to 24/7 in their crypto offerings, and that's followed, some of the crypto platforms that are now trying to move into things like commodities 24/7. And when I say commodities, it's not physical commodities. These are CFDs. These are bets against somebody else's market. To be clear, but yeah. So I do think that that is moving. The question though, getting back to the actual underlying use of risk transfer markets, I think that's moving a little slower than the more speculative, pure abstraction type markets.
And when you look out, thinking ahead to when we're all back here in 2027, there's been a lot of developments, a lot of announcements of what different companies are doing in the technology space in the coming year. You're introducing your own market OS and how that'll be rolled out. What do you think the industry as a whole needs to be doing over the next year? What progress would you like to see to feel like, okay, this technology is getting deployed in the right way to make smarter markets?
Oh yeah, no, that's a great question, a great point because at the end of the day, a regulated exchange and clearinghouse is not a single company operating. I think that's something that we've probably simplified looking at crypto markets and everything else. At the end of the day, these are brokers matching trades. It's not an actual decentralized clearing system. And so, one of the key points about the technology is people kind of have to move along together, right? It's not just regulators, it's not just operators, it's FCMs, it's the commercial clients. So, like again, 24/7 being a great example of this. You need an FCM community, a community that's ready, both in their operations, their IT systems, their risk management. You need regulators, and you also need key clients. Particularly in commodities. What happens if things move volatile on a Saturday? Are they going to get stopped out? Just because they're not trading in the more speculative end of the weekend markets. So there are these issues that you need your entire market moving together. One person can't just lead the charge. Again, that's happening in more closed system markets, but that's in our view, that's not a decentralized risk transfer market like the ones we operate. So the industry does have to move together. It can't just be solo players trying to push the boundaries.
And what would you like to see the industry move on, if you could pick one or two?
Well, again, we're obviously very biased that we think we built the real time collateral framework in a more purpose built way for cleared markets than something like stablecoins or blockchain. So we're obviously spending a lot of time getting the FIA, getting our clearing members more up to speed on that, and that's obviously going to be a big push. So, but yeah, I think having those conversations, those are the two big ones that have been happening here. Real time 24/7 market, and then the nature of prediction markets and event markets. I think are the two things that I hope and it looks like it is, but like I hope from the regulatory side, from the operational side, that we're moving in sync and not just kind of following the buzzwords and the headlines.
One other thing that really didn't come up too much at the conference, but of course it's very important, it's been in the news lately, is the CFTC and critical minerals. What's happening there?
Yeah, so there was a very interesting comment by the CFTC chair in his keynote, talking about the need for more markets in the U.S. on critical minerals, and he particularly used the words physical delivery markets, physical markets, not just indexes based on foreign markets, which is essentially, if you look at a lot of the emerging commodity markets, in battery raw materials, in even LNG. I think the incumbent market operators have been kind of falling back on just price assessments. And again, a lot of this happening outside of the US. And I think the CFTC chair and the administration is really focused on solving these problems and building local markets. So, obviously we are a team that's well versed in that, probably one of the only exchanges building physical delivery markets from scratch right now on a consistent basis. We have had conversations with with the U.S. administration, and we look to get involved in that more as well. And another really interesting thing that came out was around single stock futures. That was another conversation that was happening during the event, and it's something that we're looking at, particularly in a commodity context, that we think we can solve some of those problems as well. So, kind of stay tuned for that. But yeah, it was very good to see that a lot of our themes that Abaxx is building for 6 or 7 years are really some of the key themes and the key initiatives, both of the U.S. administration, as well as our markets.
Well, thanks so much for dropping by, Josh. Always appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.